So we might begin. So I'll ask Shayla to lead our initial prayers with us, and then we'll do actually, we might do the motivation first, I think, and then we'll do the prayers. uh, the purpose of our motivation is firstly to, if you like, dislocate ourselves from the sheer velocity of our everyday lives and to take pause by stepping back just a little to consider the shape and purpose of our time, and particularly the shape and purpose of our motivation, which is the trigger or the impulse residing behind all of our actions of body, speech, and mind. So this is a very key, hi Michael, Buddhist practice in itself, preparing one's motivation. So just spend a moment bringing the mind inwards, becoming aware of our bodies just as they are. And as we do this, we can let go of all of our engagements in our activities in which we're immersed. For the brief period we're going to spend together, we have the incredible luxury, opportunity of investigating the manner in which we're conducting our lives and the opportunity to realign, redetermine, refocus particular key aspects so that benefits will flow, not just for ourselves, but for those with whom we come into contact, and even beyond. So gently allow the mind to rest upon the breath as it flows in and out, with the out-breath dissolving all distractions, all preoccupations, all world weariness even. And with the in-breath, just feel very gently that we're absorbing inspiration from the holy Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, or the Sangha. We're absorbing all the blessings of the sacred scriptures and teachings that comprise the Dharma. And now for a few moments, we're going to reflect. I'm going to use the precious words of Kabje Zopa Rinpoche. Think to yourself, this problem I have been experiencing in my life is a teaching for me. So identify a problem with which you have been particularly involved, perhaps one that's even overwhelming, dominating, and think to yourself, this problem, this very problem, is a teaching for me. It is a teaching that if I don't like this problem, I must abandon its cause. my own non-virtue. With regard to any past negative karma, the first thing I must do is to purify by applying the 4 opponent powers, and then to abstain from performing or committing the negative karma again. In this way, the problem becomes an extremely beneficial teaching. Through your problems, you can come to like virtue. It is said, miserable conditions persuade you to practice virtue. While you're experiencing a problem, what you actually want is happiness, which is the absence of that problem. So you must think, if I want happiness, if I desire the absence of this problem, I must create the cause for happiness and the cause for the absence of this problem. In this way, I can use everyday problems as teachings, as reminders. Problems inspire me to practice virtue, the cause of happiness. Problems also inspire me to generate very deeply in my heart great love and compassion and concern for the well-being of all others. So I feel that we're going to dedicate or motivate this session towards this great goal of utilizing conditions, particularly problems in our lives, as the catalysts for the generation of immense virtue. Only in this responsible way are we positioned to actually care for ourselves in a realistic manner, and likewise care for others. So with that motivation in place, we'll recite the opening prayers. Thank you.
I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings.
And we'll recite the mandala offering. A short mandala. Yeah.
This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as the Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. O holy and perfect pure Lama, from the clouds of compassion that form in the skies of your Dharmakaya wisdom, please release a rain of vast and profound Dharma, precisely in accordance with the needs of those to be trained. Idam
Guru Ratnam Dalakam Niratayami. Thank you very much. So I'm very delighted to be here again today and to share some time together in this Discovering Buddhism module, which, although on one hand it's sort of designed to be an initial introduction to some of the core concepts of Buddhism, I think we will have had enough exposure to the topic now to recognize the incredible radical ways in which this particular practice, which is encapsulated under the term of thought transformation, this nest of practices, really challenge us at a very real level to come to terms with what we're doing with our lives and how we're conducting them and what might we be able to do with our lives. So it's a gigantic wake-up call because it throws our habitual responses into stark relief. And it's this stark relief that is the exciting ground of transformation. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that the very difficulties we might be experiencing as we come upon some of these concepts presented in the thought transformation teachings are exactly the points in which we can turn and reposition. And we're not going to do this unless we're somehow challenged. So before moving on to the presentation of our specific verses, I'm going to just, for reasons of recall, quickly read the 8 verses of thought transformation together with Thupten Jinpa's very concise several sentences, commentaries on each of the verses to give us some sense of the cohesion and organic flow of the verses themselves. But more particularly, I'm going to be asking you to think about which of these verses might contain the content that we would choose to present as part of our assessment for this particular module. So this particular invitation is only applying to those who wish to formally qualify as having completed this unit as a Discovering Buddhism module. And this requires a certain formal requirement on the part of FPMT as the sort of holder of the syllabus, if you like. And it's my responsibility as the presenter to ensure that I have in some way at least a little bit successfully communicated some of the essential points and got you thinking. So you might remember that in the initial session, I noted that one of the traditional ways of being assessed in this subject was for the student to make a 10-minute or so public presentation to the class and then to have a free-flowing discussion for a little while. That's all that's involved. Now, I'm conscious that some of you who do wish to qualify in this module are perhaps a little nervous of that prospect. So I firstly want to propose that it's not at all scary. It's just like chatting amongst friends. But secondly, if you really deeply don't want to do that, you just feel it's going to be too overwhelming for you, then I can organize a independent session just between me and you online, where you can present your 10 minutes and we can have a small discussion. So it's effectively the same content, but just in a slightly different format according to your needs. So after I have read through the 8 verses, I'm just going to spend a few moments with you finding out whom is wishing to formally be assessed in this way and how. And then on the basis of that, we'll make a decision about whether we utilize time in our last session, which will be next week, or whether we also jump to another session that could be scheduled apart from our regular time slot, which is occupied by other classes following next week. So I just want to allay any fears you have, because when presenting your little 10 minutes, I'm not asking you to be academic or encyclopedic or somehow authoritative. I'm really wishing to hear and to share with you some sense of what it is that you have taken from the thought transformation teachings, and what kinds of issues and challenges and prospects has it raised for you in terms of what you might do going forward. So this can be, as you can realize, a very personal thing. It needn't be a bookish approach at all, that you might just choose to look at one particular verse and a core idea in that verse and then riff, if you like, on it according to your own interests and needs. And that is absolutely pertinent and valuable. Absolutely what we're looking for. So some of us may be a little bit more academically inclined, want to quote some other sources or some other teachers, for example, on the topic, and then maybe look at the relationship of one bit of that to another bit. That also is perfectly fine. So there's a lot of room here for your own personal approach. So let me read the verses, and with the determined, I'm using a slightly different translation. That doesn't matter. With the determination to achieve the highest aim for the benefit of all sentient beings, which surpasses even the wish-fulfilling jewel, may I hold them dear at all times. Thupten Jinpa, beginning with the critical question of how to view others with a deep sense of gratitude, the text plunges immediately into the heart of the matter, namely the challenge of how to transform our habitual self-centeredness into a standpoint of valuing and cherishing the welfare of others. Verse 2, whenever I interact with someone, may I view myself as the lowest of all, and from the very depths of my heart, respectfully hold others as supreme or superior. In stanza 2, says Thupten Jinpa, the author then deals with the more specific question of how to implement this principle of cherishing others' welfare. A key to this, we are told, lies in adopting an appropriate outlook towards self and others, an outlook that shuns viewing others as somehow inferior. I think you can see here just how incredibly relevant these topics are to our lived lives and how we could easily talk for 10 minutes on some of these issues that have been raised. Stanza 3. In all my deeds, may I probe into my mind, and as soon as mental and emotional afflictions arise, as they endanger myself and others, may I strongly confront them and avert them. Tultum Jimpa. Stanza 3 tells us that in order for us mind training practitioners to put our spiritual ideals into practice, we need first and foremost to find a way to deal with the perennial challenge posed by our habitual afflictive states of mind. Here, Langri Tangpa emphasizes the need to cultivate and to apply in our thoughts and behavior faculties, such as mindfulness, greater self-awareness, and heedfulness. 4, I'm going to read 4, 5, and 6 together. When I see beings of unpleasant character oppressed by strong negativity and suffering, may I hold them dear, for they are rare to find, as if I had discovered a jewel treasure. When others out of jealousy treat me wrongly with abuse, slander, and the like, and scorn, may I take upon myself the defeat and offer to others the victory. When someone whom I have helped or in whom I've placed great hopes mistreats me in extremely hurtful ways, may I regard them still as my precious teacher. Tultum Jimpa says, in stanzas 4, 5, and 6, this advice on how to deal with our afflictions is taken further, with special attention given to particular types of people, beings of unpleasant character, those oppressed with negativity, those who treat us wrongly for no good reason, and finally, those who disappoint us. People, in other words, who trigger powerful negative emotions within us. These lines clearly resonate with Shantideva's famous advice to view our enemies as spiritual teachers, for they provide us the rare opportunity to practice the virtue of patience or forbearance. Verse 7, in brief, may I offer benefit and joy to all my mothers, both directly and indirectly. May I quietly take upon myself all hurts and pains of my mothers. Tultum Jimpa. Stanza 7 sums up the key principle of mind training. Transforming of our thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors to be more other-regarding and altruistic. This is done on the basis of presenting the contemplative practice of Tonglen, giving and taking, which entails mentally taking upon ourselves all the sufferings of others and their causes while offering to others our happiness and its causes. You can see here, this is the precise antithesis of the modus operandi of the self-cherishing attitude. And that's why it's the fundamental summation of the verses that have preceded. The 8th verse, may all this remain undefiled by the stains of the 8 mundane concerns, and may I recognize all things as illusion, devoid of clinging, be released from bondage. So Thupten Jinpa, in this stanza, we find the instruction on how to ensure that all of the above spiritual exercises do not become sullied by the motives and underlying states of a mind driven by self-centered, mundane concerns. The exercises should be grounded instead in an understanding of the deeper nature of reality, so that finally, free from clinging, we attain genuine freedom from bondage. So the reference here is, of course, to developing ultimate bodhichitta, which we can then combine with conventional or relative bodhicitta, if you like, and that in that way have the 2 wings of the bird, method and wisdom, that will enable us as trainee bodhisattvas to travel all the way to enlightenment in order to be able to more completely, more wondrously fulfill the needs of others. So this leads us to just a quick discussion about, from each of us, actually, I need to hear from all of us, just very briefly, whether you're wishing to do the assessment and whether you have any initial thoughts about how you might like to proceed. And don't feel embarrassed discussing this amongst one another. I'm sure we're all the best of friends and will respect the way in which things are communicated. So thank you. Who would like to go first?
I'll just be really quick.
So who's speaking, first of all? Who's
it's
speaking?
Jay. It's Jay
Sorry?
in South Australia.
Oh, Jay. Hi, Jay.
Hi, sweetheart.
Yeah.
Look, I've got really limited electricity, like none. So my answer is I don't want to be involved with that. And thank you. You might have to leave and then come back when I swap devices to try to continue on. Thank you.
We're talking about now, this minute. Yes. All right.
No, I won't do it this minute. I've got a little bit more power left on this one. But at some point, I will. Right. So I'm going to have to be quiet.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I guess I can go next. This is Thomas.
Hi, Thomas. How are you?
I'm good. I'm not seeking the certification, but it seems like it would be a useful exercise to take some time and discuss it with my friends here. So
yes.
What
if you accidentally were accredited despite yourself? Would you be opposed to that possibility if it just happened spontaneously, that you were happy and everyone was happy? And I'm just raising it as an issue.
Oh, I have no objection to being certified.
All right. So let's say that you don't need to be, or you're not demanding that you will be, but that you're going to present, you'd love to present anyway. And if it just so happens that it works out nicely, you'd be happy to be certified. I'd feel happy with that, because I'm sure what you're going to offer is going to be very, very valuable and useful indeed.
That sounds good.
Oh, great.
Yeah. And we'll do that at our next meeting then?
Yes, yeah. All right.
Okay.
Who would like to go next?
Ross, I'd also like to present, and I'm in the same position as Tom. If I get accredited through the class, that's awesome. If not, that's awesome too.
All right. Great.
you want to know which verse we might be thinking of?
No. I really want you to have open slather, if you like, because I'm trying to invite you to pick up those aspects that really matter and work for you in the teachings that we've been looking at together. There's a beautiful saying that Geshe Rabten, one of Lama Zopa Rinpoche's teachers and many of our teachers made. He said that, it sounds one of those sort of Zen-like statements, isn't it? He says, if you push the corner of the table turns. So I take that to mean that when we're trying to transform ourselves, we don't have to transform everything en masse in a single gigantic upheaval of transformation. All we need to do is to work on an aspect that we can actually modify and transform. And through the power and momentum of that small but nonetheless significant change, will then open up the possibility of changing other things. That's the table. So there's no topic too small. There's no detail somehow too trivial here, because it's in those little details that we often find the most potency and meaning and the most powerful point to practice thought transformation. So for that reason, I don't want to in any way prescribe or demand that you do this verse or that verse. You can present on a verse or several verses together, or you can take just one aspect of a verse and discuss that, present that. So we've heard from Jay, Thomas, and Michael. So Karen.
I'm not going to be seeking certification, but I've certainly enjoyed this class very much. So thank you so much for the.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for being part of it. And I think everyone would agree that the presenters, that they'd be happy, wouldn't they, for everyone to attend that session, because we are friends, and it would be really nice to share and to help one another at that time. So Karen, feel very welcome next session, and we'll also, if we've got extra time, be able to look at some of the other issues in the verses as well. So it could be partially a class also. So Scarlett. I can't hear. Oh, there we go. Hi, Scarlett.
Yes, hello. I feel the same with Karen.
Yeah.
I am not seeking certification, and I've really enjoyed being part of the class. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So neither Karen nor Scarlett want to present, I take it. So you're happy to participate in the class, but not present.
Yes. Thank you.
Great. So that means we've got Jay. Jay's still here? Are you wishing to present next week?
Okay. No, I don't want to formally present. I'm happy to talk about, and again, I can expand a little bit on how looking at things from a Buddhist point of view helps me problem solve and deal with my various emotional states. I'm happy to talk about that a bit. Yeah. If that's appropriate.
Yeah, okay. But without seeking accreditation as such.
No, sir. I don't need accreditation. Thank you. Yeah.
So for my reading of what was just transpired, we've got Michael wishing to present next week for accreditation. Shayla, what's your position on that?
I don't feel comfortable to test just yet. I think I'll wait another year, but thank you.
All right. Lovely. Thank you. So, Michael, are you happy to present next session?
Absolutely. And I think, not wanting to get ahead of yourself anyway, I think Thomas wanted to present as well.
He did. Sorry, he did too. You see, he was in not seeking, but could accidentally be accredited. So we'll say both Thomas and Michael. So thank you for correcting me there. So you're happy with that, Michael?
Yes, absolutely.
Great. And Thomas?
Yes.
Great.
Yes. And let me just say, I hope you're feeling better this week. It occurs to me that you were in some trouble last time.
Yes, I was indeed. I was on some quite heavy painkillers from my injury to my back, and nonetheless, I was attempting to do my thought transformation techniques and as well as I could, because it really does bring home, I find, the fragility of our human body. It's just so ridiculously fragile. It's miraculous, as Rinpoche says, that we wake up in the next morning. How amazing, he says, that we have woken up again, given the incredibly fragile circumstances. So, as we know from a Buddhist perspective, these aggregates, particularly this form aggregate, is, in my case, regarded as an afflicted aggregate because it's being thrown by karma and delusion, and therefore it is prone to suffer, like leaning into suffering. We don't have to sort of deliberately create causes for the suffering that we experience through our body. The body has this incredible tendency to suffer just by virtue of the manner of its constitution, independence on its causes. So this, in a way, leads us back to Kabje Zopa Rinpoche's earlier point in the motivation, that if we want to do something about this afflicted body, we need to remove the causes of having an afflicted body. And this is one of the aspects, of course, of the path itself. And it's really through realizing the ultimate nature of reality that we're going to be able to slice through the delusion that is enabling us to generate karma that has the capacity to throw us again and again and again into states of suffering. So it's this throwing us again and again into states of suffering where we have to bear the burden of these afflicted aggregates that is the definition of samsara. I find this very valuable to think about, because sometimes we look at this topic superficially. We think samsara is something we're in, like a cherry inside a bowl. We're in samsara. So if we get out, we leave samsara behind and we're samsara-less. But no, it's much more complex. Samsara is us, in the sense that we're immersed in it at the very basis through our constitution in this regard. So that afflicted set of aggregates is conditional on having afflicted causes. If we can generate pure causes by, for example, learning to give our body and as a gift to others through service and other forms, then we create meritorious karma that will ripen in having a body or a material base that's less and less afflicted, and eventually will be totally pure. Totally pure. The Buddha's body has not a skerrick of problem or suffering connected to it. It is a radiant, pure body from which spring all virtues spontaneously. This is an extraordinary goal. And this is why in some of the tantric practices, we talk about the 5 aggregates in terms of the 5 Dhyani Buddhas. We can actually transform each of these aggregates into a state of enlightenment through the path itself. So that's the extent, the remarkable extent of our potential transformation. So I just mention all that because it relates to Thomas's kind words about my physical health. Yes, it hurts, but it's also, as Rinpoche says, a reminder to practice. And I've also been, my running around has been sort of cut short, for at least temporarily. And so I'm being forced, you'd like to know, to be more contemplative. I might even meditate a little bit now, because I'm not going to be able to get engaged in so many external affairs. And so I could say that my accident is actually a blessing for my teachers, because it's inviting me to do retreat, mind retreat. And of course, the corollary of that is that my body's capacity to heal will be, if there is any capacity, will be enhanced just through the virtue of the fact that I'm resting and allowing myself to recuperate at that level. Whereas if I'm manically driven to do all my usual stuff, I'm going to be dragging this poor broken body along behind me and expect it to somehow recover. So that's not going to happen. So are there any further issues or thoughts you might have about the assessment next week for those who are wishing to present? So if you do have any issues or thoughts or want some further clarification or even some guidelines that might assist you in your formulating your presentation, do feel free to reach out. And you can do that via Michael, who will, I'm sure, respect your confidentiality and forward those emails onto me, and I can respond directly. Are you comfortable with that, Michael?
Absolutely. I was just going to chat to Thomas. Thomas, since I'm speaking now, so just drop your email in the chat to me. If you have any questions, I'll put my email there to you.
So thank you very much for spending a little bit of time looking at that aspect of our module, and we'll return now and to our text. And I wanted to, as I have been doing each session, you'll have noticed, revisit a few steps back and then proceed forward again. So verse 5 says, when others, out of jealousy, treat me wrongly, with abuse, slander, and scorn, may I take upon myself the defeat and offer to others the victory. So this instruction, I think we'd have to agree, is exceedingly challenging and appears to be very difficult to implement. And it's perhaps harder to implement, according to our notions as we currently hold them, than the ideas contained in the previous verses. So we have to put effort into clearly understanding the meaning. Geshe Doga proposes, as a means to help us do this, that we can consider 2 points of view to help us explicate this verse. Firstly, we have what we can call a worldly approach. And this is the normal, habitual approach we have, where if somebody treats us badly and abuses us for no reason, then it is fitting, appropriate, to try and correct them, to somehow adjust, realign the situation. I think we'd have to agree that most of us would be sympathetic to that worldly approach. Because in a worldly context, someone who defends themselves when they are treated badly is considered a good person, a decent person who knows right from wrong. From a worldly perspective, suggests Geshe Doga, the practical approach would be fitting. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second, the spiritual approach. Geshe Doga says, but for someone determined to achieve enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings, and to develop love and compassion as a means to attain the awakened mind, the approach has to be different. The act of retaliation and returning harm for harm would be inappropriate. If we were to do that, then we would have lost all opportunity to benefit that being. How can we benefit someone if we harm them? Our intention to benefit all sentient beings will be distorted and not be fulfilled. This is why the worldly approach is inappropriate. So let's swing that onto ourselves. Geshe Sonam Rinchen suggests, by remaining calm and kind, and by not getting angry, we purify our negative actions and create merit, which ultimately, and I emphasize that word ultimately, is of great benefit to us. But this will only happen when there is no self-interest in our actions. More positive energy is created by accepting others' criticism, scorn, or scolding while remembering the kindness of other sentient beings than by making even the most extravagant offerings. In other words, this is an incredibly powerful time to practice thought transformation and particularly to generate virtue. So His Holiness likewise emphasizes this distinction between a worldly and a spiritual approach. His Holiness says, even though in a worldly way it is proper to respond strongly to someone who has unjustifiably and without reason accused you, it does not fit in with the practice of the altruistic aspiration to enlightenment. So His Holiness here is contrasting the worldly approach to the spiritual approach. However, he qualifies by saying it is incorrect to respond strongly unless there is a special purpose. If someone out of jealousy or out of dislike treats you badly with abuse or even strikes you physically, rather than responding in kind, that's retaliation, you should suffer the defeat yourself and allow the other to have the victory. His Holiness then asks, does this seem unrealistic? This is a question we should be asking ourselves. Does this instruction seem unrealistic? Of course, this type of practice is very difficult indeed, but must be done by those who seek one-pointedly to develop an altruistic mind. So you can see here there's a great care being placed on the precise motivation with which we're responding to experience. If we're wishing to generate the altruistic mind, intent on benefiting all others without exception, we must respond to difficult situations by not harming and not retaliating, or not seeking to turn the injury back onto its source, if you like. So His Holiness does again add a caveat. He says, this does not mean that in the Buddhist religion, you only take the loss all the time and purposefully seek out a bad state of life. So that would be a perverse motivation, wouldn't it? Where we actually deliberately walk in to difficult situations in order to experience difficulties. That's not what we're asking people to do at all. His Holiness says the purpose of practice is to achieve a great result by undertaking small losses. So would anyone like to suggest from their own understanding what the great result might be and what might be the estimation of those small losses?
So I think for me, it kind of goes back to that little cherry comment you made, where I'm a cherry in a bowl, or I'm a cherry outside the bowl, right? Right. Where it really is, I am samsara, right? But I am also emptiness. In my form, there is emptiness, which means I am also nirvana. And the choice is, which one of those two do I choose to see? Do I choose to live in? Do I choose to exemplify? And do I choose to wish for that other person? And do I have the bodhichitta mind to say, I wish you to be not the samsara, but the nirvana. I want to be able to bring you along to that. So I want to move myself from one to the other, and I want you to be there with me.
Yeah. I think it's a very moving answer, actually, because you're suggesting that we can be very deeply in tune with that altruistic intention, based, as you're suggesting, very, very importantly, on an understanding of our fundamental Buddha nature, our potential, each of our potential equally to become fully enlightened. If we look at other beings, as you're suggesting, in this way, as sharing this Buddha nature, this what we might sort of call natural nirvana in one sense, for speaking very generally, then the kind of usual prejudicial judgments and responses that we formulate in relation to others and the difficulties that they might be seen to be provoking completely alter their character, their appearance, don't they?
Absolutely.
And so this is why, as we know from Shantideva's verses, there's a beautiful, famous image there where Shantideva says, when we're being abused by someone, we should not blame the person, but blame the afflicted mind, which is wielding that person like a stick to injure us at that moment. So if we take one step behind the situation and see that the afflicted mind is the problem and not the person, this is another way of getting to this idea of the fundamental value of the person. We have the opportunity, if you like, of rescuing our regard for that person from the momentary act of that person acting out of a deluded mind with intent to somehow scorn, harm, or injure us. And if we can look at things in that more expansive way, as indeed we must if we're training to be bodhisattvas, then the capacity of that moment to actually hit us and injure us is radically resolved or even dissolved away. So I just look at my own, the way in which I habitually tend, if someone's insulting me, to start generating a negative thought towards that person. It comes instinctively through my training in delusion over countless lifetimes. And in that structuration of the scene, I become virtuous and over here getting injured by a bad person who's unvirtuous and over there. And that kind of fencing off of self and others is in fact itself a delusion, because we're not these two beings existing in radical polarity at all. What we're doing is, through our own ignorance and our incapacity to act according to the spiritual approach, is cementing and solidifying the very perceptions of that person's that are being generated by our own afflicted response, habitual response to what we're perceiving as harm. So as Kabje Rinpoche Rinpoche was proposing in a very, very direct manner in that earlier meditation we did, if we can relabel that moment of abuse as a blessing requiring or inviting us to practice virtue in that moment, then it becomes a very real spiritual practice indeed. So, in other words, the boundaries of that polarity break down, and we begin to see realistically that person who formerly was appearing as a total, obnoxious, repellent enemy. So even on a worldly level, if you begin to analyze these topics, we see, don't we, that someone whom we regard as enemy in our playground, childhood playground, can become our best friend in adult life. And our dear life partner, I'm talking about that procedure called divorce or separation here, can, for whatever reason, suddenly become a stranger. And so even in worldly terms, there's no stability in these categories that enable us to polarize positions in such a vehement and determined manner. So in a sense, we're refusing to accept the porous manner in which we interact with one another and the ways in which our happiness depends on others. In that moment of polarizing, we become a kind of massive entity, self-righteously situated against you, without any capacity to critique or investigate me, because I'm right, aren't I? I'm right. That's why I'm responding so vehemently to your abuse. I'm going to yell back and get you. That kind of grandiosity is itself a grotesque flowering of the self-cherishing thought. It's blossoming in a really, really deformed and disturbing way, and we're allowing that to happen. So that's why His Holiness is saying that if we're going to practice thought transformation, we must learn to accept the defeat, if you like. However, all the lamas, as I mentioned last week, are alike in saying that there will be particular circumstances where it is unskillful, and we judge it to be unskillful, to let another perform a harmful action without any consequence. So we have to use our intelligence. So His Holiness says, in general, this is the advice we've been given as spiritual practitioners. But in terms of our daily lived experience, we must use our discriminating wisdom in order to position ourselves wisely or carefully. But this doesn't involve positioning ourselves to justify retribution or revenge, even and especially at a later date. Because as you know, one of the resentments can be harbored and they can bear their fruit years later. It's not until we get that person in the right spot again. It's often when that person is appearing the most vulnerable, unfortunately, that this self-cherishing mind takes the opportunity of doing the final work to destroy them. We see this in world politics, of course, all the time. So, does anyone know the three types of patience that are presented in in Buddhism. We talk about the perfection of patience. So these are presented in the context of the Lam Rim, and they're particularly valuable to consider. So the first type of patience is the patience of non-retaliation. And this involves taking no account of those who inflict harm. So when we're saying take no account of those who inflict harm, we're saying we do not buy in to the scenario where we're going to have to somehow inflict harm back, at least in equal measure, in order to hold our ground. The second patience is the patience of enduring suffering. And this is sometimes translated as forbearance. Means developing an ability to take on and experience problems willingly and happily in the course of our spiritual practice. Because yes, problems will definitely arise and be experienced. So we endure suffering graciously, if you like. And the third one is the practice of studying Dharma, but it really means that we are patient in regards to ascertaining the meaning, and particularly the subtle meaning of the teachings. We're not going to be able to understand or access all of these incredible words of advice in one lot. Sometimes the Lamas, in fact, another one of Geshe Rabtin's sort of little stories, he says, we don't seek to gobble down the Dharma as does a dog a lump of meat. We don't approach the Dharma in that way. We're selective, we're skillful, and in a way we moderate our approach so that we don't become overwhelmed or too pressured or too prone to become disappointed, just as importantly, when we don't somehow achieve the goals that we're expecting to have because we're now spiritual practitioners overnight. It doesn't work that way. So His Holiness says that, this patience means that if at the end of our lives, say we're on our deathbed and we're in a position to cast our minds back, if we can honestly feel that we are ending out this lifetime with a kinder, more compassionate mind than we had earlier on, how joyous is that? That is a sign that we have been a spiritual practitioner. So this is a beautiful way of judging our spiritual practice, just this capacity to be a little kinder, a little more compassionate. So the point we're making here is that when others provoke me, perhaps for no reason or even unjustly, instead of reacting in a negative way, as a spiritual practitioner of altruism, I should be able to be tolerant towards them. And so this tolerance is a form of patience because it's giving us a space, if you like, to view that person more accurately, more skillfully. And if we can bring ourselves to do that, sort of open-eyed in a radical way, because we're not being closed in and shut down by the operation of our prejudices, we will see a precious person there who, for whatever reason, is suffering. And therefore, we can feel genuine concern and compassion for them. So it's interesting, isn't it? Sometimes when I notice I won't go into details, but gun laws are an interesting issue in America, I know. And it's fascinating when sometimes someone does go on one of these rampages and a number of people are shot. They interview often the families who have lost someone. And the range of responses to what should happen to the killer are often remarkably different, aren't they? And I was watching a program the other day, and the woman said of someone who had caused great harm to a family member, may they rot in hell. That was her deepest, most intense wish. May they rot in hell. She couldn't think of any destiny more appropriate. But in that same interview, one of the other families of someone who'd been lost was approached, and she said that she didn't support the death penalty, and she wanted that person to be imprisoned. She didn't want them to be loose because they were potentially a danger to others, but that she had no wish to seek revenge. She said she hoped that they would find happiness and come to some understanding of the fault of their actions. And so for me, that second response is imbued with what we might call a spiritual approach. So you can see here how incredibly real this topic is. So in other words, through this notion, we arrive at the link between true patience and compassion. True patience, says Geshe Doga, is when we have the power to crush someone, but don't do so. Out of great compassion, we endure the harm they inflict on us without retaliating. Patience will naturally develop when we have a strong feeling of compassion towards others. This is an important point to contemplate. So I'm just going to illustrate, read out our story, which is found in the thought transformation literature to illustrate this kind of patience. There is a story about a monk called Sangye from Ganden Monastery. Sangye's main practice was training his mind to develop love, compassion, and bodhichitta. After finishing his studies, he didn't have anywhere to live, so he moved from place to place, practicing as he wandered around in a remote area somewhere in South India. One day, Sangye was sitting where some dried branches had fallen. He collected the branches and made a small fire to boil some water for tea. But some men in charge of the forest came by and accused him of stealing their wood. Picking up wood is a big thing in India. It's a property of someone. You don't just take it for your fire. So the men started to criticize Sangye, and they even beat him up a bit. The monk only had 3 rupees in his pocket, but he took them out and said to his assailants, "You have been extremely kind to me. Thank you. Thank you so much." And he offered the 3 rupees to the men. The men were really shocked, and realizing they had made a mistake, they left Sangye alone and shamefully walked away. So I think a beautiful story. So it really suggests, I think, we probably have our own takes on it, but it proposes the ways in which Sangye in that moment, by responding in the way that he did, created the perfect circumstances for those men to recognize the extent of their harmful intent and to withdraw it with regret, recognizing that it had been inappropriate. All of that was embedded in Sangye's generosity when he offered them the only money that he had. And he offered it genuinely for them, not to get them to go away and leave him alone. He wanted them to benefit from the 3 rupees. So returning to the verse, you can see that we must approach these topics by considering their proper context. And as mentioned before, rather than being a complete defeat, a small loss we experience, as in the case of Sangay's story, will lead to great gains in the future. Sangay's capacity to take further steps on the path have been enhanced. He's created virtue, which will ripen as a capacity to benefit others increasingly, and also to develop more and more patience. But it's also had this other benefit of acting as an instruction to the assailants to perhaps take responsibility and not jump in, lunge in so forcibly with their judgments next time they encounter a person in a forest. So in our meditation for the week, I'm still sending Michael our student reflections for each class, by the way, and these will act, I'll just mention now, as a perhaps as a guide for our presentations as well. We might want to address some of those issues that have been invoked there. So accepting defeat and offering the victory to other. We can think of a situation, I'm not going to do this meditation now, but we can think of a situation where someone insulted, slandered, or disappointed us, verbally abused us. So in our meditation, we think about the state of mind that was driving that person at that moment to say or to do what they did. And we ask more deeply, were they happy as they acted in this way? And through the power of this investigation, we give rise to a compassion that can forgive them and also feel compassionate to others in a similar situation. Another aspect of that meditation can be exploring, hypothetically, if you like, what would happen if we accepted that we were wronged and managed to let go of the resentment without retaliating or seeking to have the last word. So we can actually act out this response in the hypothetical or imaginative space of that meditation in relation to that incident. And in this way, we can imagine also how we might accept their harsh words with a calm mind without fighting back. And this involves thinking, would we lose something very real perhaps, if we did respond in this way? Could it help the situation? What would happen, in other words, if instead of sowing bitterness, we sowed forgiveness? And so again, we can explore this capacity to let the situation go and to re-embrace our concern for that person. And that becomes the conclusion of the meditation. So this gives you an indication of how we can actually apply these techniques in meditation. Are there any thoughts or reflections that have been stirred up as we've been considering these points? So we can move on then to verse 6. When someone whom I've assisted and in whom I've placed great hope inflicts me with extremely bad harm, I shall view him or her as my spiritual supreme friend. So Geshe Chekawa indicates that this verse refers to the second kind of patience, willingly bearing suffering. So in order to oppose the delusions, we must remember the disadvantages. Particularly when with friends, enemies, and strangers, those we like and those we don't like, we must remember in those situations the disadvantages of the delusions, and rather than generating them, rather than giving into them, we seek to remain with a happy mind. So this happy mind that we're maintaining is the patience of forbearance, because it enables us to ride that moment of difficulty and come through it fundamentally unscathed, because the only thing it can injure, if we really investigate, is our self-cherishing. That's the target that hurts when struck. If we can think outside of our self-cherishing by relying instead on this mind that's wishing to cherish others more than ourselves, then any disappointment we might have when others don't fulfill our expectations can be accommodated without struggle. So more particularly, because this person's invited us by disappointing us and also perhaps inflicting great harm on us, they have manifested themselves as our spiritual teacher, inviting us directly to generate patience. So they become very precious in this way. And so, as His Holiness said before, if we can train ourselves to deal with small problems, we will be able to take on a capacity to increasingly deal with larger and larger problems. We must start somewhere. So we don't seek to start with the really big ones. We seek with the little incidents that happen in daily life where we have this instinctive response of sort of grievousness, sort of self-upset that arises when someone else doesn't fulfill our needs or our expectations. That's the moment to transform the self-cherishing attitude, because it's being fed. It's feeding and is being fed by that situation. So Scarlett, what would you like to say?
What I was wondering, what I was wondering is what you just spoke about, when that sort of arises, what would be like a remedy to help us?
Well, rather delightfully, I would suggest the practice of Tonlen meditation, which we're going to be discussing in the context of the later verses of the practice, and particularly the 7th verse. And that's where, when that person has disappointed us because of some collapse that we're perceiving there, some failure, we take that failure onto ourselves and give that person all the success. We wish them all the success and everything they need to fulfill all their ambitions.
Is that to help us not cling to the situation? Like, what if something like, if something happens right there and then, what would you suggest would be a remedy?
Well, I actually do Tonlen in those situations as my remedy, as my first port of call. And I'm not saying that I do that because I'm some sort of special kind of practitioner. That's a ludicrous idea. But because I have contemplated the value of thought transformation, and particularly giving and taking meditation, I hold onto that as my essential practice. And so it arises more or less easily if one has trained in circumstances prior to that moment. So it's very important to begin to train ourselves in the practice of giving and taking so that we can then apply it on the spot. So I mentioned in one of my other talks a very personal example of my Tonglen practice. And I only mentioned this publicly because Kabje Zopa Rinpoche asked me to talk about my Tonglen practice to others. And I found that a very embarrassing prospect, and I put it off for many, many years. And finally, I agreed to give a talk on Tonglen. And I shared this very, very direct story, which I'll very briefly share now. I was attacked in a street by a gay basher. So I'm a gay man. I was in a gay area at night, and I was ambushed and attacked at knife point by someone who wanted to carry out grievous bodily harm. So I had a knife held to my throat. I'd been kicked in the stomach and had fallen to the ground completely winded and dazed. And the guy said, "I've got a knife." And I could feel the point of the knife pressing against my throat. So this was obviously a very, very real and extraordinary moment. And I tell you the full story. Unbeknownst to myself, a thought came to me, which was like a voice, and it said, "I don't want this." And at that moment, I leapt up and span. Now, I've never done martial arts and I've never spun in the air before, but I span coming down, and that spinning dislodged the knife from the man's hand, and he ran. And I was left there. And in the moments where I was trying to come back to my senses, because I was in a state of extreme shock, as you can imagine, I remembered my thought transformation practice and took on all of that person's suffering, including the karma of his potentially murderous act, and gave him all happiness and circumstances necessary for his achievement of enlightenment. And that was, I think, the most powerful moment of Tonglen I've ever practiced, because of the nature of those circumstances. And it was only later, I was taken to hospital, and I discovered I had a broken arm, I had a broken nose, I had incredible bruising. But in some part of me, I was very calm and very settled about how I had responded to that incident. I had absolutely no regrets. However, you'll be perhaps pleased to know, I did nonetheless have the wherewithal to make a police report. Don't know if you're thinking about this in terms of the 8 verses, because I recognized that that person was a very potential and real danger to other members of our community. And it was my responsibility as a citizen to make sure that that person wasn't free, if you like, to continue acting in that savage way, targeting vulnerable members of the community through hatred, as it turns out. Now, to my knowledge, that person wasn't apprehended or wasn't discovered. I had very little information to give to the police, but I didn't have any sense of contradiction between those two parts of my response. So when I was very sick in hospital, at the time of my bone marrow transplant, Tonglen was the practice that I relied upon as my primary practice. So it's something that you can do in the very midst of the most extreme and difficult circumstances. So I went to visit with Geshe Doga a friend of mine, an artist who was dying. And I'd been interviewing this man for a number of months because he was a famous Australian artist, and he had very, very wonderful and often very peculiar views of reality. I mean that in a nice way. He had very idiosyncratic thinking. It was fascinating to find out what he thought. And so I'd interviewed him and sort of probed, as in a polite way, to find out how his personal cosmology worked, because it also informed his art practice. And he never once inquired or mentioned the fact that he knew that I was a dedicated Buddhist who at that time was living in Tara Institute, an FPMT centre in Melbourne. However, just before his death, his wife rang up and said, Roger has asked to see your man. And that was a reference to my teacher, Geshe Doga. So that came out of nowhere, but there it was. That was his death wish request. And so I immediately rushed upstairs and requested Geshe Doga to come to visit my friend Roger, who had asked for him. And Geshe Doga, before you could even snap your fingers, was in a car, and we're on our way to visit Roger. When we got to see Roger, Roger was lying sort of on a bed. He was too weak to lift his head and so forth. He was in the late stages of the death process. Geshe Doga took his hand and sort of massaged it quite sort of forcefully, which I thought was interesting. And that created some return of Roger, if you like, to the place, because he'd been absorbed in his sort of process, if you like. And Geshe Doga leant over and whispered the Tonlen instruction into Roger's ear. Give all your happiness to others and take on all their suffering. Do you understand what I mean? And Roger smiled, nodded, and shut his eyes and didn't return again, if you like. And after that point, we went back to the Buddhist Centre, and a couple of hours later, his wife rang to say that Roger had died peacefully, and to thank Geshe Doga for visiting him at that important time. So I don't think we need to look very hard to see the incredible value of the thought transformation teachings as epitomized in this particular practice of giving and taking. So I just sort of offer that humbly.
Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I was meant to have post-traumatic shock and all that. I did have post-traumatic shock, I must admit, but it was a particular kind. I became highly sensitized to my surroundings, and particularly when in public, I was very conscious of who was around me and particularly who was behind me. And I also noticed that I stopped riding my push bike at that time. It wasn't a conscious decision. I just didn't ever ride my bike again. And I realized when I realized that I was no longer feeling as secure in my body. I didn't want to put my body at risk needlessly. And riding a push bike in a big city is a pretty dangerous affair at the best of times. But I don't feel that I had dramatic psychological trauma from that incident, although it obviously did have the potential to cause that. And I don't mean that in a chivalrous way to show that somehow, again, I'm some sort of special kind of practitioner. I suggest it only because that is the power of this Tonlen technique. It can radically realigns the forces in play, so much so that we don't have to engage it in our usual habitual narrow way. And so the benefits flow spontaneously from the application of the technique. I think that's what I'm trying to suggest. So let's move to verse 7. In short, I shall offer benefit and bliss to all my mothers. So this is one gesture, offering, giving out benefit and bliss to all my mothers in this actual life and in the future continuum. So I'm making this wish not just now, but on behalf of all my future moments, and shall secretly take upon myself all the harms and sufferings of my mothers. So Geshe Doga says that this practice is done with the motivation of benefiting other sentient beings, not with a self-cherishing thought. And this is because when we take suffering, the suffering of the others, we take it with compassion. And when we give benefits and bliss to others, we do this through the force of love. So love and compassion, which in one sense are like two sides of a miraculous coin, have different aspects in the way they operate. They both have benefits, immense benefits, but they are slightly different in their application. So with love, we wish to give the conditions that benefit others. And with compassion, we wish to take away the conditions that might thwart that. And so it's this two-part gesture, if you like, seamlessly coordinated, that provides this incredibly potent meditational technique because it can be combined with the breath. So as we breathe in, we take all the sufferings of others. This is just a very concise example. And when we breathe out, we give them all the benefits and joys and so forth that they could possibly have and need, both now and in all future times. So we don't need to be in a special place to practice Tonlen. We don't have to be in meditation posture. We can be walking down the street. We can be paying for our groceries at a checkout in a supermarket and perform a complete cycle of Tonlen practice in just the moment that it takes to breathe in and out. It's not to say it has to be that short, but we can do a complete practice in that span of time if we're practiced in meditation. So the main benefit of this technique is that it acts as an antidote to ill will and harmful intent. This is because love and compassion are the antidotes to all problems. If we had love and compassion, if we all had love and compassion, and let's face it, we would not have any capacity to harm or exploit one another. It's as simple as that. Most of the problems of humans, for example, would be eradicated almost immediately if love and compassion were our dominating emotional forces. So are there any comments as we go? Because it's some of us may already be engaging in this practice and would like to share their experience of it, or they might have heard about it but not quite being sure what to do next, or it might be coming as a complete shock that such a practice exists. Jay, thank you.
Yeah, okay. I'm back online, thank God, which is good. Okay. Yes, I have used it, and it's very beneficial for me. I don't know what else to say. It's like when I was working, there were a couple of people that I just did not get on well with, to put it politely. And I did manage to see, okay, these are my teachers. I've got to be aware of that. and I need to send them, of all people, compassion. And so it was indeed helpful. So it's my go-to, really, and very helpful for me. The other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about or understand a bit more about is, for me, I do have an awareness that if I allow somebody to abuse me, that I'm allowing them to create more karma. I'm not doing them any favors. And I am acutely aware that preventing them from doing this has to be handled in a very tactful, sensitive manner that's not going to get us into conflict. Yeah. And I've had plenty of practice doing this. And I have observed, like in colleagues who did not do this, they would end up feeling very grumpy with people, very angry and bitter. Yeah. It was clear. And I just thought, oh my God, put boundaries, and then you won't have those kinds of feelings, and try to, I didn't say it, I couldn't really say this, but well, I tried to in a subtle way, sort of like, oh, I just don't take that stuff seriously, blah, blah. But recognizing that the person comes from a background where this is how they were taught to behave, and to accept that. So yeah, those were my comments I wanted to make, and question if you want to expand more about putting boundaries and concern about, because obviously if we allow people freely to abuse us, it's not in their interest, blah, blah.
Exactly.
Okay.
I think that's a good example, isn't it, of that need to be interpretively, selectively skillful as we navigate these thought transformation techniques. So as His Holiness says, we must look at the actual situation in its particularity rather than overly generalize in order to know how to best respond. And so I think, again, this is why the advice has been, I'm trying to emphasize particularly today, that we work on the little corner of the table in order for the whole table to eventually turn. We have to start somewhere. And then on the basis of what we experience and the way we manage to grow, we're then able to take on more increasingly difficult situations. Having said all that, getting back to your earlier point about being abused, there is the freedom and the right of ourselves, if we're being abused, to walk away or step out of that situation in order to prevent the abuser from being able to carry out the kind of trajectory of their abusive sequence. And of course, I'm referring to that sequence because often verbal abuse can lead to physical abuse and so forth. It's the culmination of verbal abuse. It's the setting up of the grounds for an actual physical attack in the case of domestic violence and so forth. These are very real lived situations, and we have to be extremely delicate and extremely sensitive as to how we might approach them. So in other words, a responsible Buddhist response in that acutely dangerous and difficult situation is to get out. Because if you placate and yield to that abuser, it's just going to create the foundations for another episode of the abuse. It has to be terminated. It has to be severed. And you can only do that. One can only do that by ourselves stepping away. So the Buddhist approach is going to enable that person to step away with great clarity and conviction. They'll be able to be very stable in that stepping away because it's not tied up with the counter attack of having to somehow get back or change that person forcefully in some way. It's based on an accurate recognition that that person is a problem, and the best thing for me is to get out of here. So ring up some friends, go to a refuge, whatever's needed, should and must be done, often urgently. So the Buddhist values in these situations comes, I think, similar to my assailant story, is that I didn't have to spend vast amounts of time after my attack re-navigating whether that person was ultimately good or bad or not, because I had accepted that they had sought to injure me out of a mind generation such as hatred, and that was the problem. That person, as Shantideva was saying, was being wielded helplessly like a stick in the hand of hatred and was carrying out the injury. So Shantideva says, when you're hit with a stick, you don't blame the stick, you blame the person wielding the stick. When you're hit by a delusion, an action generated by a delusion, you don't blame the impact, you hold responsible the delusion that is generating that action. So this is a very profound Buddhist insight, and it enables us, I'm going to use the word detoxify, it's kind of detoxify the inherent perception of badness that we can somehow have of other people. As Michael said earlier, there is great potential there, even in that person who's seeking to harm or to injure us. And so we can't abandon them, ultimately. Geshe Dogra said, if we abandon one person, we have abandoned our bodhisattva vow to liberate all mother sentient beings. So may all mother sentient beings achieve enlightenment except Fred, who abused me last week. That kind of selectivity is a collapse of our total awakening mind, because we've forfeited one sentient being. We've placed them into an exceptional category where they have forfeited all their rights, if you like, in terms of our concern for them. And that is a failure of our love and compassion, definitely. You can see here how the topics become very, very real very quickly, I think. So next week I might go into, we'll have the presentations, and then if there's extra time, I might say some more about the Tonlin meditation, because there are some very specific details to the meditation. But there is also, as Michael will know, a meditation in our student kit, resource kit, which is Lama Zopa Rinpoche's brief Tonlin meditation. That was part of our resources. That is an excellent, concise account of the Tonlin meditational practice. So you might like to investigate that. But I would like to say that when Geshe Doga introduces this technique often to audiences who may not have had prior contact with Buddhism and this idea of thought transformation, he suggests something that is very, very interesting indeed. He says that when we wish to develop a Tonlin practice, guess who he chooses our first object? Does anyone have any ideas? We're not going to bother about everyone because we haven't got there yet. We're going to take one person, and we want to take all their problems. Who do we choose?
The person we love most.
And who might that be?
A partner, a child.
Yeah, that's all. Yeah, exactly. Geshe Doga takes it one step further.
You choose ourselves?
Ourselves.
Yeah. Isn't that extraordinary? So those two situations are exactly together. We love our special family member, so it's incredibly powerful to do Tonlin with them as the object. But it is incredibly powerful to start with ourselves. And so this is a way in which the technique can be used directly in our navigation of life problems. So next time you're having a really, really, really rotten time, visualize yourself in the space in front and take all of your difficulties and problems in the form of kind of gunk and smoke, which stream forth in a beam and are absorbed into your heart, where you have the self-cherishing attitude, your own self-cherishing attitude visualized as a kind of lump or a pile of dust. There are different variations in the visualization. And as those two collide, the self-cherishing attitude in your heart is completely pulverized and disappears without a trace. So it's like antibodies in a way working. Scarlett?
Sorry, can you say that again? I think I missed it. Are you saying that I would visualize another of me in front of me?
No, you visualize you. You imagine, it's talking about the power of imagination. You imagine or you feel that you are there in front of me, the meditator. So it's like a double. So yes, you're right. We're sort of imagining that we're there, and that this person who we know to be me, actually, who's the same as that person there, however, is taking out a special role in this meditation, which is I'm going to take all of my suffering on and leave not a trace. And in the process, destroy my self-cherishing attitude. And then we move on to our mother, our children, our various loved ones, then onto strangers, then onto enemies, and then onto beings in the different realms of psychic existence. So it can become incredibly expanded and incredibly comprehensive over time. But there's a particular poignancy, I'd have to say, in starting with ourselves. And I think this came through to me when one of my close friends, very dear friend, was diagnosed with inoperable cervical cancer. And I was trying to work out how to respond. I knew I was going to, I wanted to see her and be with her. So it wasn't as if I was attempting to have a spiritual solution in the face of actually offering real and practical engagement and support. But it was also a kind of shock to hear that that's the situation she was in. And so I sat down and did Tonglen meditation, visualizing that I was taking on her cancer and giving her a cancer-free body. And my self-cherishing thought, which was lurking somewhere there, suddenly went into panic mode and ventriloquized the ghastly thought, what if this meditation works and I get cancer? This actually thought arose. I don't like this meditation. I might get sick if I take on other people's suffering. That is really scary, that idea. But that is a misunderstanding of the technique, because as the lamas often reinforce, we're imagining, we're training in visualizing behaving in this way. It's not actually possible to take on the suffering of another person and to give them happiness. If only the Buddha would have done that time immemorially long ago and would all be fully enlightened, because the Buddha wanted nothing more than for all of us to have ultimate happiness and total freedom from suffering. But they don't have the power to do that. Only we do. So we're thrown back onto this issue of self-practice. We have to engage with transforming ourselves. And so it's this acknowledgement that legitimizes, if you like, placing ourselves as an object of compassion and also of love. Because if we're incapable of doing at least that much nurturing, how on earth are we going to nurture this person and the next one? We're going to be so dysfunctional, so defective, so incapable of generating positive thoughts that we will be effectively stymied in that. So there's great psychological significance in that technique of taking from ourselves first as the initial training in the Tonglen practice. Yeah. So just for a moment, let's do a very, very simple Tonglen meditation, visualizing ourselves in the space in front, facing towards us, so face to face, just as we are. And then by considering the preciousness of this one person and how they seek to find happiness and to avoid suffering, think to ourselves how wonderful it would be if we could take all of their suffering away. So the mind that wishes this is the mind of compassion, non-judgmental, universal compassion. So now feel that all of our problems and difficulties leave from the person we're visualizing in front of ourselves and comes in an arc of light This light is a kind of indistinguishable light from the problems and difficulties themselves. It's a kind of polluted light, if you like. It's the essence of all the problems. This pours into our heart as the meditator, and as it does so, it spontaneously dissolves away all our self-cherishing, leaving not even a single atom, the barest trace behind. And then out of this spaciousness, which we've generated in the center of our hearts, we visualize a radiant light, healing light, essence of enlightened energy, reaching out and pouring into ourselves, whom we're visualizing in the space in front, giving them, this person, i.e. ourselves, everything we need in terms of perfect bodies, both now and in the future, perfect minds, perfect resources, food, drink, and so forth. We can be very specific. Shelter, environments without conflict or war, all the resources they need to flourish on the spiritual path, both now and at all and every stage of the path to enlightenment. We can even visualize this person, i.e. ourselves, transforming into a radiant Buddha, the actualization of our Buddha potential. It's being fulfilled. And we can leave the meditation at this point. But as I mentioned, we don't stop there. When we're familiar with doing that and we've sort of practiced, we can then invite more and more beings into the sphere of our meditation. And it becomes cosmically expansive, this technique. It embraces each and every being without exception. So I think we'll dedicate any merits we have towards these great purposes. And thank you, Michael. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. We also dedicate for the long life of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and all our precious teachers. I'm not referring to myself here. I'm a student. But without our precious teachers, we would be guideless, wandering without knowing which way to turn. So we request our precious teachers to continue to turn the wheel of Dharma and to live long and not pass into parinirvana. We also make requests that our precious gurus who have left us in a palpable form may quickly return to guide us. So we seek, in particular, Kabje Zopa Rinpoche's swift return and the assembly of all the conditions for the recognition of the incarnation, so that the Dharma of the will-turning king can again flourish. Thank you very much. That's not presuming that Kabje Zopa Rinpoche is going to reappear in a male body. We don't know what aspect at all, but it's said to be very, very important to make requesting prayers because we're sealing our karmic connection that we've been able to maintain with our teacher as we move forward into the future. So thank you very much. And we've covered quite a lot of ground tonight, so we'll have time to revisit some of those points again next week. But in particular, I look forward to the presentation. So I really admire and respect your willingness and bravery in jumping in. But to reassure you again, there's absolutely nothing to fear. It's a chat amongst friends. So I'm sure it will go really well. And you'll actually enjoy and be delighted by what transpires. So thank you very much. Take care.